Hi everyone. So in this video, we'll be looking at the ovarian cycle as well as the uterine cycle. And a lot of people get confused with these two cycles thinking it's the same thing. Yes, they work hand in hand and they use the same hormones, but they are very different things. The ovarian cycle deals with the ovary, and the uterine or the menstrual cycle deals with the uterus and the endometrium. Okay, so let's take a look at the ovarian cycle first. It's 5 easy steps, right? So if you had looked at the previous video, you would have known how the primary follicles develop into the secondary follicles and all of that, right? And all of that is involved in the ovarian cycle. So the primary follicles, which are there since birth, will eventually mature into the secondary follicles at puberty, and then from then on they would continue to mature into the Graafian follicle, which has the oocyte here. All right, so if I could bring up the oocyte, here you go. And during ovulation, now, which we will see in the menstrual cycle, when you get there, the oocyte is released from the Graafian follicle, and the Graafian follicle turns into the corpus luteum. And depending on whether the oocyte is fertilized or not, the corpus luteum will either remain or degenerate. And that is essentially the ovarian cycle. 5 very easy steps, and you can see here a very good diagram, very easy steps there. So this is essentially what I just said in just a little more detail, right? So you can have a screenshot of this and read it, right? I will talk about the hormones when we get to the uterine cycle, so you can talk about both at the same time. All right, so a little bit about ovulation now. So during the cycle, as I said, the primary follicle develops into the secondary follicle and Graafian follicle, and the role of the follicles is to supply the oocyte with nourishment, and that's why you can see the cells around these cells here around the egg getting bigger and bigger, supplying it with more nutrients. All right. So remember that the secondary oocyte contains the haploid number, right? Because it needs to fuse with the sperm, which also has the haploid to create diploid. Okay. So the first hormone that we need to know about is estrogen. All right. So the secondary follicles actually produce estrogen and also progesterone, which is not really important at this point in time. Estrogen, however, causes the endometrium, which is in the uterus. So this is how they are linked, right? So the secondary follicle, which is in the ovary, produces estrogen, and this affects the endometrium, and this starts to thicken. Okay? And progesterone also causes thickening, but more so, it actually allows the endometrium to stay thickened. All right? So the Graafian follicle is larger, and eventually the oocyte will be released from the Graafian follicle at ovulation. Okay, and we know the whole story where fertilization will occur when the sperm meets the secondary oocyte, right? And that fertilization will stimulate the completion of the second mitotic division. All of this is in the previous video, to form your ovum. All right. And importantly, once fertilization occurs, the corpus luteum, right, which is produced in any case, will be maintained, and this produces a large amount of progesterone. Right, progesterone is very important. So progesterone will cause the endometrium to increase in thickness and also remain thickened. Okay, and the uterine glands will also start producing a thick mucoid secretion so that it could receive the fertilized egg, and it helps in implantation as well. And if fertilization of the ovum does not occur, as I said before, the corpus luteum will degenerate after about 10 days. Right, so let's see how they are linked here in menstruation. So remember, we have FSH and LH before we have estrogen and progesterone. So FSH is the hormone that stimulates the secondary follicle to produce the estrogen. LH stimulates the corpus luteum to produce progesterone. So FSH and estrogen go together, and LH and progesterone go together. So before puberty, the levels of your gonadotropin releasing hormone is low. The gonadotropin releasing hormone stimulates the production of FSH and LH, right? You can remember this from the previous video. But after puberty, in the hypothalamus, it increases hormone production. So GnRH is going to increase, FSH is going to increase, LH is going to increase. All right. So the ovarian cycle is said to have a follicular phase and a luteal phase. So as you might expect, the follicular phase is where the primary follicle starts developing to the secondary follicle and then the Graafian follicle. The luteal phase now is where the Graafian follicle releases the oocyte and then the corpus luteum begins to form. Luteal for luteum. Okay? So in the follicular phase, we have FSH. FSH, as we said, is tied to estrogen. So FSH is going to promote the development of the follicle, and the follicle is going to produce estrogen. Okay? The high level of estrogen now will cause the hypothalamus to secrete a large amount of gonadotropin releasing hormone. And this is important. We all know about negative feedback, which is where you have a large amount of something like a hormone, and then it feeds back to the system, and then that system reduces the production of the hormone because you have enough of it. However, this is one of the rare instances of positive feedback, where even though you have a large amount of a hormone, it feeds back to the hypothalamus and it still increases the hormone further. And it is positive feedback which will trigger ovulation. Right, so this is very important. Right, so the hypothalamus will secrete a large amount of GnRH, and this will cause a surge of LH by the anterior pituitary, and LH will stimulate ovulation. Very important. Okay, now we have reached the luteal phase of the ovarian cycle, where the progesterone begins to rise. And just as LH, the surge of LH occurs, you see the progesterone rising because LH and progesterone are linked together. Okay, so now as I said, depending on the fertilization, this will cause the corpus luteum to degenerate if fertilization doesn't occur, and menstruation will begin as a result, which is the shedding of the lining. All right, so here we have the diagram that we've all been waiting for. Right, this diagram kind of puts the two cycles together and shows how the hormones interact. So on top here, in this first one, we have the FSH and LH levels. Down here, we have we have the ovarian cycle here for you. Below that, we have the ovarian hormones, which are the estrogen and progesterone. And in the last box, we have the menstrual cycle or the uterine cycle. Okay, so we can see the special names for the ovarian cycle. I'm going to label it here so we could see, right? Ovarian cycle, and this is the uterine cycle. You can see in the ovarian cycle, we have the follicular phase and the luteal phase. In the uterine cycle, we have the proliferative phase and also the luteal phase. So the uterine cycle now is influenced by estrogen and progesterone. And what influences estrogen and progesterone? Well, they simply go up to FSH and LH, which are controlled by the ovarian cycle. So you see how the two cycles are linked. Okay? So, as I said before, during the follicular phase of the ovarian cycle, right, because of the secondary follicle, estrogen is produced by the secondary follicle, and as you see here, the level of estrogen in the blood rises. Right, as the follicles begin to develop, you can see more and more estrogen. And if you line up the estrogen with the uterine cycle now, you can see here that as estrogen rises, the lining, this is the level of the lining here in the uterine cycle, right? The lining begins to increase. Okay? So the ovarian cycle now will produce the estrogen and cause the endometrium to thicken, and this now is called the proliferative phase. Proliferative, building up, right? So estrogen causes that. Now we've reached day 14 of the cycle, which is where we have the surge of LH, right? So you can see the surge of LH at day 14. And remember what the LH surge does? This is due to positive feedback, right? So positive feedback. The LH surge is going to coincide with ovulation. And after that, remember, it was the follicle that was producing the estrogen. Well, after that has ruptured, the estrogen levels drop, right? And after that now, we can see, because we have a LH surge, the level of progesterone begins to increase, which is the red line there. LH and progesterone go together. After which, we have the production of the corpus luteum in the luteal phase of the ovarian cycle, and the function of the corpus luteum is to keep producing progesterone. So you can see that during the luteal phase, the level of progesterone is maintained. However, if fertilization does not occur, we can see the progressive degradation or degeneration of the corpus luteum, and now the level of progesterone will begin to decrease. So if we line up the level of progesterone with the uterine lining here, we can see as the level of progesterone increases and maintains, the uterine lining or the endometrium also increases and is maintained. This is the optimum level for the implantation of a fertilized egg. However, once the corpus luteum begins to degenerate and the progesterone levels drop, we can see a dramatic decrease in the level of the lining, and this is where shedding occurs or menstruation occurs. There will be bleeding and also clots, right? And this is the cycle of the uterus. So proliferative phase, luteal phase, menstruation. It will start all over again in 28 days. Okay, and this is in short the ovarian cycle and the uterine cycle. So you can take a screenshot of the note here. This is just a more well laid out form of what I just told you. Alright, so in the next video we will look at fertilization, the placenta, also contraception as well.